Hi everybody, and welcome to our second video for language development. I'm going to finish our discussion over chapter 1 of Baker's textbook, and then we'll also shift toward chapter 4 of Baker's textbook. So first, going back to chapter 1 of Baker's textbook, we're going to talk about the concept of balanced bilingualism. Balanced bilingualism is the concept where people are equally good in both languages, their first language, their native language, and their second language. Sometimes, though, however, can be a problematic concept. Empirically, it's been shown that very few people actually have the same abilities in their first language and their second language. Also, it's very hard to have the same exact abilities when language has 4 domains: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And so it's very hard to have someone who has the exact same abilities across all 4 domains and across both languages. Normally, one language has at least some slight dominance over another, or especially in a certain domain, many times one language will be slightly higher in speaking, for example, than the second language that's being learned. Another problem with this concept is that it could be used to describe someone that has equally low proficiency in both languages. So if you were describing someone who had a very low ability in either language, you could technically call them a balanced bilingual because they have an equally low ability in both languages. And the problem with that was if you use that term balanced bilingual, it would almost sound like a positive thing that person has a very low proficiency in all the languages they speak. So Baker ends the chapter by discussing the different views of an individual's bilingualism. You have the fractional view versus the holistic view. The fractional view is often held by monolingual speakers who do not have a lot of exposure to a second language or who have had difficulty learning a second language and choose to remain monolingual. The fractional view is the concept that within a person there are 2 separate spheres for each language. So within a bilingual person, you have, for example, a Spanish sphere and an English sphere. And those 2 spheres of a language do not interact. There's not any switching between languages. Each language has a defined context, and it's only used in that situation. For example, I'm bilingual in Spanish and English. So if someone had a fractional view of my bilingual abilities, they would say, oh, well, he only uses English in the academic setting, and he only uses Spanish in the social setting. That would be the fractional view, that I would be confining my language abilities into one area, one context, and that there wouldn't be any intermixing or interchange or relationship or interaction between the two languages. Moreover, if you use the term, if you use the fractional view, sometimes speakers of the minority language will feel inferior because they're expected to speak only their minority language in one context, in the home setting normally, when really they should feel like they are able to speak their language in a variety of contexts. Another concept that Baker describes is semilingualism. Semilingualism is a way to say that someone has semi-developed their abilities in another language. And so the problem with semilingualism as a term is that it's a negative term. It's a deficit way of thinking. People have not reached the ideal state, and they are being criticized in the term semilingual. It's almost like the pessimistic, the glass is half empty mentality It's a deficit thinking mentality where people are viewed as not being enough, and their failures and their lack in areas is being emphasized. On the other hand, a better term to probably describe someone who's still developing their abilities in their second language is an ascendant bilingual. We've used that a lot in the last video. So an ascendant bilingual is someone who is growing or improving in both languages, including their native language and their second language that they're learning often in the school setting. And with the ascendant bilingual term, it's a very positive, optimistic, glass half full mindset where it's a growth mindset in that students are being recognized for their progress and their improvement and growth in learning their second language. Another debate on terms that Baker mentions is the debate between limited English proficiency, or LEP, and English language learner, ELL. Sometimes the government has even used the term LEP in official laws or in official policies for the federal educational system, and sometimes also the state of Texas has used the term LEP. The problem with using the term LEP, limited English proficiency, is once again it recognizes deficits. It focuses on the negative, that people have not reached the desired levels. They are limited. A growth mindset would focus on the term English language learner, and that's the term we're going to use in this class. So in this class, and it's more and more used in educational dialogue. So English language learner, once again, is a growth concept. So the person is learning and developing and improving in their abilities in English. They're not stuck at the limited state, but they are growing and proving more and more ascendantly bilingual. Baker also discusses at the end of the chapter conversational fluency versus academic language competence. So conversational fluency, or another term to call that is surface fluency, often takes about 2 to 3 years in the school setting. Conversational fluency means that students can communicate socially, they can answer basic questions in class that don't require a lot of extensive or complex language skills. They can in general understand many of the everyday conversations and everyday language that their peers and their teacher uses. Academic-related aspects of language involve academic vocabulary, complex sentences, or more complex communication. And this normally takes 5 to 8 years in the academic setting. And it could even take more to develop. And often our state assessments, the STAR, and also our national assessments used for college admission, like the SAT and ACT, are written using academic language. They're using academically related aspects of language. And so many educators become kind of befuddled when they see that they see a student that can converse fluently in English, has little to no accent, understands most of what the teacher is saying, and can participate pretty well in class discussions on kind of basic topics. But when it gets to a complex concept with advanced vocabulary, that's academic vocabulary, that student starts to drop off in terms of their comprehension abilities, and they start to struggle more and more. And so this is obviously evident of the fact that the student's academic language has not been fully built up. And so many content teachers across various contents, so science, social studies, math, and of course English language arts, make a concerted effort to pre-teach academic vocabulary or connect academic vocabulary to students' native language through cognates, words that sound similar. So like science, the cognate in Spanish would be ciencia. And so many of those teachers connect students to the academic vocabulary. They teach that academic vocabulary because they know that once students get to that level of language, many English language learners struggle with that academic vocabulary. And so content area teachers, regardless of whether they actually are formal English language teachers, will teach English vocabulary to students so that they can ensure that students' comprehension of the content is sufficient. Baker then goes on to describe the holistic view of bilingualism. So fractional view is what we talked about first. That was the negative, glass half empty, deficit mindset kind of thinking with bilingualism, where people have two different selves. They have their native language self and they have their English self, and they do not interact. Well, the holistic view is the opposite. It's saying that people have two languages, and those languages interact and support each other. Moreover, it argues that you shouldn't compare directly monolinguals to bilinguals, especially in the very early grades, like elementary, because it's like you're judging someone on different skill sets. So Baker uses the analogy of a high jumper, sprinter, and hurdler. That a hurdler kind of combines both high jumping and running or sprinting in their event. However, when you evaluate someone in the Olympics or in the track and field event, you only you have different events for each specialization. So a high jumper only has the high jumping event. The hurdler only focuses on the hurdler event, and vice versa. And so if you put it as an analogy to language, let's say sprinters are native Spanish speakers, high jumpers are native English speakers, and hurdlers are kind of bilinguals. They mix both skills, English and Spanish. Well, in this metaphor, according to Baker, you wouldn't judge a bilingual directly to their ability in just one language. You would actually compare bilinguals to other bilinguals, and you would look at their abilities across both languages. Moreover, Baker talks about how the holistic view also moves away from traditional language tests that just focus on reading comprehension or vocabulary knowledge or fill-in-the-blank grammar or fill-in-the-blank word substitution tests that have often been given as standardized tests. If you think about the STAR, reading and writing, it's mostly multiple choice, reading from passages, and so the holistic view would say, let's move away from using only those measures as ways to judge bilinguals, but also to consider how bilinguals effectively use both languages to communicate and how they can communicate in particular contexts with both languages. Bachman's 1990 holistic view of bilingualism further elaborates on those concepts. So Bachman breaks language into, or language abilities into two areas. You have language competence, which is your knowledge of the features of that language, the grammar, spelling, syntax, vocabulary, reading comprehension, writing structures. And then you have language performance. Language performance is the actual ability to communicate within a language, to function within a language in certain domains, and to understand the culture of the language. And so part of that culture is the different dialects. So to be fully developed in your language performance skills, you can understand different dialects. You can understand the New York City dialect and the Southern dialect, or the Midwestern dialect, for example, in English in the United States. So strategic competence is when individuals regularly and proactively plan which languages to use and in what context. And normally bilinguals do this to best facilitate their ease in communication and effectiveness in communication. So a bilingual person will consider what would best get my point across to the listener and what would be the easiest for me to communicate this point. Once again, the holistic view considers communicative performance testing. So they would want bilinguals to be also evaluated in real-world situations. The only problem with this is it's very hard to evaluate someone in real-world situations and to simulate that. That can be very difficult. Texas has tried and in many ways succeeded in increasing their holistic assessments of English language learners in the TELPAS. For those who are new Texas teachers or unfamiliar with TELPAS, TELPAS is the yearly assessment given to English language learners in Texas. It evaluates those learners on speaking, reading, listening, and writing. And TELPAS used to be about half done on paper, so it used to be half done through students reading passages and then answering questions, and then also half by students writing essays in English. And then the other half would have been the teacher themselves evaluating the student on their speaking and listening abilities. Well, now the TELPAS has become even more holistic in that it gives students real-world situations on the computer where students are requested to speak and to answer listening comprehension questions based on listening recordings that they've heard. And then students are also, of course, still required to do reading passages, so to be assessed on their reading comprehension abilities in English. And finally, the TELPAS also evaluates how students communicate in real-world context. So students are supposed to write at least 2 or 3 essays in content areas, so in content-specific areas like math, social studies, and science. So students are using their language in a content and context-specific situation. Moreover, many times the TELPAS has certain time elements of writing, in that students are many times asked to write in the past tense, for example, so that students can be evaluated on their ability to use English in past tense context, so in a specific context. Now let's move to Chapter 4, Baker's Chapter 4, which is focusing on language and society. And like the title of the chapter, a lot of this chapter will be at the macro level. It will be at the global level, not just the micro individual level that we had talked about in Chapter 1. Baker begins the chapter by explaining that bilingualism is on the rise. Bilinguals make up over 1/2 to 2/3 of the world's population, and that number is growing. Once again, the focus of the chapter is at the macro level. It's about large group of people, society level, cultural group level, not at the individual level. It's also coming from the socio-linguistic perspective. It's not necessarily how one individual uses language, but how entire groups, classes, ethnicities use language to communicate. The first concept Baker outlines in Chapter 4 is diglossia. So we have learned bilingualism, where an individual uses 2 languages. Diglossia is where a society has 2 languages that function. And oftentimes, each language has a specific function in a society. So, for example, in India, there are 15 recognized languages and probably even more tribal languages in India. But in India, the official languages are English and Hindi. They are used in the academic setting, in the business setting, and the political setting. And then many times the native language of the specific region will be used for everyday communication, social communication, and everyday small small size business. Singapore is the same way in that in Singapore there are many different ethnic groups, but all groups are taught English in school and then also their native or home language. And so Indians and Singaporean Indians are taught both English and Hindi, and Singaporean Chinese are taught English and Chinese, and so on and so on. So with diglossia, there's still a dynamic between the two languages. You have a majority language, which is the language that's most spoken. It's spoken by the greatest number of people, and also it's predominantly featured normally in business, politics, and academics. So our majority language in the United States is English. Often the majority language has become the more prestigious language in a country, and people who speak that language tend to be able to move up more quickly in the economic, social, and academic areas. So they're able to move up with more ease based on their proficiency in that majority language. The minority language is spoken by native speakers, and it's spoken by fewer people in number, and often it's spoken primarily in the homes and the community areas where those language populations live. Normally the majority language becomes the main language spoken in business, politics, education, and mass media, although many times too the minority language could have mass media representation, for example, or political representation. Like in the United States, majority of our channels on TV are in English, but we also have several foreign language channels, primarily in Spanish. So some countries or communities have diglossia and bilingualism. So you have both individuals that speak two languages or more, and then you have large communities that speak two languages or more. That would probably be a good example of the United States. We have many bilingual individuals, but we also have very large communities that speak two languages, or very large communities that speak one language predominantly versus another one. So in the Panhandle area, we would have communities that have both diglossia and bilingualism, especially with Spanish-speaking communities, and also with maybe also in many refugee communities in the Panhandle, they would be diglossia and bilingual communities because they would speak their native language and also English. Sometimes you have countries that have bilingualism but without diglossia. So in this case, you have individuals that speak two languages, but there isn't, the language spoken is not set into one particular setting or one particular community. And we're going to kind of get into more detail in the next slide. So similar to that is transglossia. Transglossia is Baker talks a little bit about how sometimes minority languages choose not to directly compete with majority languages. They don't try to fight to see who's going to be the dominant language. Instead, they focus more on intergenerational transmission. Intergeneration transmission is when the language is transmitted across the generations, from the grandparents to the parents to the children to the grandchildren, I guess you could say. And the intergenerational transmission, of language allows for language to continue, and many times that is the end goal for minority language communities. So native indigenous language in the United States, like Cherokee, or Lakota are minority languages, but they don't directly battle with English per se and which language must be spoken in those communities, but there's a concerted effort within those communities to transmit and to further teach their cultural language. So generations pass down that language, and that language is preserved. If intergenerational transmission does not occur, then unfortunately you might have things like language loss, or you might even have language death, which we'll talk about in a little further. So some countries have different language policies, and many countries, language policies are based on territorial principles. Like the country of Belgium, there's 3 regions: the Flemish-speaking region, the German-speaking region, and the French-speaking region. And based on the geography or the geographical confines, the area, the territory in which people are located, that will be the language that is the majority language in school, business, and politics. The only problem with that is what happens when people move from one part of the region to another region, and does that mean that people who are minority speakers in that region are not allowed to speak their native language? Are they not encouraged to speak their native language because they should just instead, many people would say, oh, well, you should just move to the place where they speak that language. Well, for many people, that might be very difficult to to move their whole families, and just for the purpose of being able to have their language be the majority language. Then you have the personality principle, which is a variation of the territorial principle, but it's kind of like a direct response and, in my opinion, an improvement on the territorial principle. And the personality principle is basically saying that in areas that have large numbers of majority speakers and minority speakers of 2 specific languages, like in Canada, both languages are respected and given equal treatment in politics, in education, in the business world, in government. And so in Canada has a majority of the population that speaks English as their first language, but many also people are native French speakers, and the French speakers have been in Canada for hundreds of years. And so Canada has made a law that says that official communication must be written in to a person in their native language. So if they prefer English, they'll receive communication in English. If they receive French, they will receive communication in French. Also, most signs in public places are in English and French, and a person has a right to be educated in their native language, regardless of where they are in Canada. So if you are a native French speaker living in an English section of Canada, like Ontario, you are still allowed to receive communication in French and still allowed to be educated in your first language. Let's discuss the idea of additive context versus subtractive context. So an additive language context is when, just like in math terms, something is growing, and the thing that's growing, the quantity that's growing, is the language ability. In this case, it's the language ability in the second language and the first language. So in an additive context, the person keeps their native language, they maintain that, and they grow in their second language. This is normally viewed as more positive context, and in bilingual programs in the United States, one additive context is the 50-50 dual language, 2-way dual language bilingual programs. In those programs, you have students that are native Spanish speakers and native English speakers that are put into a mixed classroom from pre-K, and they speak half the time in English and half the time in Spanish. And so what happens is both groups end up learning both languages, and so they maintain their native language and they learn a second language and are fluent in that second language. So that's an additive context. A subtractive context is a negative context that does the reverse. Often, the native speaker of their first language loses their first language as they transition into more speaking the majority language. So if we were using the Spanish-English context in the United States for bilingual education, native Spanish speakers enter transitional bilingual programs and they start speaking a majority of their time in Spanish, most of their instructions in Spanish. But eventually, the language of instruction transitions into English. So by third and fourth grade, most of the classes are taught in English. And so the problem with that is that sometimes students, if they are not directly reinforced at home in their native language, since they're learning only English in schools, they might forget their native language. And so that's a subtractive context because their native language is decreasing while their second language is increasing. Let's talk about language shift and language maintenance. So language shift is the transition from one language to another. Normally it's the transition from the minority language to the majority language. And it's based on a generational context. So in the United States, many times there was a 3-generation shift. The first generation immigrates to the United States from another country, and they bring their native language, and they preserve their native language. They might learn English, but they communicate at home in their native language. Then their children, the second generation, are bilingual in both the native language, the heritage language, and English. They're learning English in schools, and they're being influenced by their English-speaking peers and by English mass media and English pop culture. And so the second generation becomes bilingual in both. But then sometimes it's the second generation starts to shift toward preference to the majority language, or in the United States, English. Then the third generation, the grandchildren of the first generation immigrants, are more likely to speak only the majority language. So in our situation, English. And so that would be a 3-generation shift, where it goes from bilingual with preference to the native language for the grandparents' generation. Then the parents' generation is about either balanced bilingual and maybe also shifting toward dominance in English. And then the third generation, the grandchildren, become almost all completely dominant in English, the majority language. Now, this doesn't always follow in 3 generations. It can be 4 generations, it can be 5 generations. It can be even not have a shift at all. There could be the opposite, which is language maintenance. So one example of language maintenance would be the Amish community in the United States. So the Amish community has been in the United States for over 200 years, several more generations, or just 5 generations. But they've been able to maintain their language and pass on their language to each generation. They've been able to pass on their native language, Pennsylvania Dutch, which is actually a dialect of German, and they've been able to pass that on to each generation, and it hasn't been drowned out or replaced by the majority language, English. Baker gives several different factors for why sometimes we have language shifts and we have language maintenance, and we'll get into those a little bit more detail in the next slides. So one reason for language decline or language shift from one to the other, and where there's a reduction of native speakers in a language, is, there are several factors. But when you have language decline, unfortunately, if it keeps on progressing, it keeps on going, you have only a small number of people who are speaking that language, and it's getting progressively smaller each time. The problem is you could have a language death, where you just lose that language. So the factors that contribute to language decline or a shift into fewer people speaking a native language are many. One of them is urbanization. So in Latin America, for example, often the native indigenous languages decline when populations start to move to cities for increased educational and economic opportunities, mostly economic opportunities. So when indigenous populations in Latin America move to the city, their children end up getting influenced by those 3-generation or 4-generation or 5-generation shift patterns, and they end up eventually shifting towards speaking Spanish primarily. And so that could lead to language decline in Latin America. Another type of example where decline or language death could occur is the forced suppression of language. And using once again the Latin American context, hundreds of years ago there were hundreds of different indigenous languages in the Southwest North America, and South America, and Central America. And then the Spanish imperialists, the Spanish explorers, if you will, came and imposed on the native population that everyone spoke Spanish and everyone worshipped in Spanish and Latin. And so the native population was forced physically to speak that language, and that ended up leading to a massive decline in native languages and even language death, especially in the Caribbean. So, for example, Puerto Rico had Taino Indians, and they had their own language, but that language has almost completely disappeared in Puerto Rico. It was replaced initially by the Spanish, and it was replaced with Spanish. It was forced upon the native people. Another issue could be loss of population or separation of groups. So if you are a small language group and your population significantly decreases or becomes isolated, then that can lead to a language decline or even language death. So Taino population decreased a lot in Puerto Rico, and that contributed to the language loss as well, because the Taino population was either physically killed or many contracted horrible diseases like smallpox, and so that population was decimated so much, and that there are, of course, some descendants of that population, but most of them have been mixed race, or there's much less of a Taino community in Puerto Rico, and so the Taino language has very seriously decreased up to almost death. Another reason could be also just economics and prestige. So sometimes in some regions, a native language might be less and less popular among speakers because speakers are shifting to another language, the majority language, that holds a dominant place. So more and more people are shifting toward the majority language because they see the benefits of speaking in that language and getting added business opportunities, added political opportunities, and also because the majority language is represented in the laws of the country and the pop culture of the country. Language resurrection is when a language has declined significantly, almost to the point of death, and then the language has been revitalized and recovered many times by native speakers and community activists, but also many times by academics and teachers. And so language revitalization, one important feature of that is that the native language is being revitalized by being taught in the K through 12 setting to children, so that children will pass on that language to their children. So it's intergenerational transmission. One example of language resurrection occurred in the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man is a small island between Ireland and England. If you know the Bee Gees, who sang Staying Alive, Nights on Broadway, many other big hits, they were from the Isle of Man. And the Isle of Man, the native language was Manx Gaelic. Manx Gaelic drastically decreased in terms of the number of native speakers when it was banned in the 1950s in the Isle of Man. In fact, students who spoke Manx Gaelic in schools would be punished and beaten. And so it almost declined up to nearly language extinction. But there was an active, after the laws changed and became much more progressive into allowing people to speak their native language in the community and in schools, several researchers and second speakers of the language helped to revitalize the language. So these people were not native language speakers. Their first language was English, but they had learned Manx Gaelic as a second language from maybe their grandparents or elderly people in the community that had preserved that language. And then those second language speakers who had learned Manx Gaelic later in life worked with academics to transfer Manx Gaelic to the young generation. So the second speakers taught Manx Gaelic as the first language to their children. And then Manx Gaelic became the first language of instruction in schools, in some schools. And so Manx Gaelic has largely become revitalized and resurrected in the Isle of Man. The next slide talks about language conflict. So Baker explains that language normally is not the cause of many ethnic conflicts or the cause of many political conflicts, but many times language ends up being a symbol of that conflict. So many times when different groups are fighting, they will also use language as a way to isolate certain groups and to unfortunately punish certain groups based on their language practices. Sometimes language rights can even be used as a form of social control. And so we talked about the issue of historical in the 1600s, 1700s, early 1800s of the Spanish forcing the Spanish language onto the native population in Latin America. Well, that has happened across the world. And so language has been used as a form of social control and cultural control, unfortunately. Now, the next shift of the chapter talks about how language affects nationalism. So first, nationalism is the belief that people within a certain territory have a common culture, history, political institutions, and they have their right to self-government. And so language often is used to support the idea of nationalism. So people within one nation in general have a national language, a national culture, a national history that's kind of a collective history, and they have a right to self-control in that region. This developed based after the French Revolution, because in France, even up to the French Revolution, there were several different languages spoken in France. But after the Revolution, the French, I guess reformers, or whatever you like to call them, the revolutionaries, decided to establish a unified language for France, and they decided to establish a more unified common culture and common history in France. And so that ended up being spread to other countries in Europe and across the world. The only problem with nationalism is that many times nationalism has been used to suppress minority voices and to even punish minorities. So we've seen how nationalism in Germany under Hitler caused genocide against the Jewish population, the Gypsy population, the Roma population, and other groups. And we've seen how nationalism in other countries has been used to discriminate against people who speak a different language or are from a different minority ethnic group or have different belief system. And so that's where nationalism can be dangerous, and how Unfortunately, language can be used as a tool to promote nationalism in some bad contexts as well. So once again, nationalism and using language in terms of nationalism can be risky because, or not just risky, but can be detrimental to many minority groups because they want to maintain their language, their identity, their culture, and they feel that language is essential to is like a, is a point of reference to their civil rights. And if they're not able to express their language, if they're not able to practice their identity or to practice their civil rights, it's a very negative situation in those countries. They're dominated by too much overzealousness nationalism. So Baker also defines different terms under nationalism. So a supra-ethnic state is when a country has several different ethnic groups, but they end up trying to choose one unifying language and one unifying culture or cultural identity in an effort to try to unify the country. And so an example of this might be in some countries in Africa where there's many different tribal languages and many different tribal cultures and traditions. But since they are now living in, since after colonialism has left and they're all in one geographic territory under one government, they've decided to establish an official language and a somewhat of an official culture, if you will, a common cultural identity to unite the people. And Baker explains that one reason why lesser developed countries, lower developed countries choose to do this is because practicality might be beneficial. For example, if you have very few resources for education, it's very hard to make an educational system that accommodates every single language variety in a country with many different language varieties. And so if you're a country that has limited resources and there's so many languages and so many different dialects within those languages, sometimes it's just easier just to have one official language. Apart from nationalism, which we talked about, there's also been a move to supranationalism. Supranationalism is kind of the opposite of nationalism in the sense that this is where people identify with a global identity and kind of a worldly or common identity across countries, across the globe. And one reason why people are developing this global identity or this regional identity instead of just a national state identity is because there's increased economic interdependence and increased communication between countries and regions. Moreover, several countries have joined together sometimes to have a united front. So one example is the European Union. They joined together and are linked economically, politically, and socially. And so many Europeans not only identify with their home country, they don't only say they're Greek or they're German or they're French, but they also say they're European. So they connect to that common identity as well. Based on this, Baker argues that bilingualism will continue to grow because more and more people believe in supranationalism and believe in the global identity, and so more and more people will choose to not only learn their native language, but also learn their non-native language, the international languages that unite people. Baker then ends the chapter primarily by discussing English's role as a global language. And so Baker explains how English is a global language in three different contexts. So the first context is when English is the native language or the native language, the first language of the majority of the population. And so if you look to the flags to the right, you can see countries where English is the majority language. So the United States is one of those situations where it's the native language of the majority of the population in our country. The second type of context where English exists is when English coexists with other native languages, and often sometimes English becomes the official language. So many times in former colonies of Great Britain, So South Africa, India, Singapore, Caribbean islands, and other parts of Africa, normally sub-Saharan Africa, English is one of the most common languages spoken, and it is also many times the official language. And the reason they have that in some of these regions is because, as described earlier, there's many different languages spoken in each of those countries. And so a way to unite the people under one common identity and one common language was to make English the traditional language, the official language. Excuse me, not traditional language, but official language. The third group of countries have English not having an official status, but English plays an important role as a popular foreign language. And this is most of the rest of the world, especially Western and Eastern Europe, South Korea, China, Japan, and the Middle East. So in these countries, English might not be the official language. It might not be a language that was initially spoken by a lot of people that moved to that region, but rather people have chosen to take up English and to learn English as a second language. So it was interesting in the Baker text that in the former Soviet Union, so Eastern Europe, their second language used to be Russian, but now since the Soviet Union has kind of collapsed, countries like Slovakia, Romania, those countries have chosen to learn English as their second language more than to learn Russian. So sometimes politics plays a role in what will be the second language choice. Baker explains a couple of reasons why English is so popular. There are some critiques of English playing such an important role in the globe. So one critique is the idea of linguistic imperialism. So linguistic imperialism is the idea that language policies were largely perpetuated based on imperialism and colonialism. So when the strong, wealthy powers, normally from the Western European countries, colonized the less developed, less wealthy countries in South America, Africa, and Asia. And so many times, unfortunately, especially with the British Empire being one of the strongest colonial powers, was that in many of those British colonies, English was forced upon the population. It was either they were forced to speak it by physical force, or they were forced to speak it by economic force. So if they didn't speak it, they didn't have any economic opportunities. And so one critique of focusing on English language development in other countries where they had a native language other than English was that using the English language would not allow those countries to develop their own identity and culture. So Mahatma Gandhi, or Mohandas Gandhi, was, as many of you probably know, a leader for decolonization of India. He was an Indian leader who fought for Indian independence from Great Britain. And one of his arguments was that people should develop, or people in India should focus on developing Hindi rather than English, since if they focus solely on English, it would inhibit their ability to develop their own unique Indian identity and culture. Another critique of English is that normally in many developing countries that were former colonies of Great Britain, in those countries, many times the elites are the ones that speak English. And they use English as a criteria, or English ability as a criteria, to restrict less affluent communities or less elite native populations from rising up in economic and educational status. One example would be in South Africa. So in South Africa, unfortunately, it was kind of like the United States, where they had segregation, and they had a legal segregation where blacks and whites were separated under a system called apartheid, And just like in the United States and South Africa, the black South Africans were given much fewer opportunities and much fewer resources than the white South Africans under apartheid. But even after apartheid ended in the 1990s, there are still issues with educational inequalities in South Africa. And one reason is language policy. So in South Africa, there are many different tribal dialects. And so one of them is like Ubuntu, I believe. And if someone speaks the tribal dialect and grows up in a rural area or grows up in an area that's predominantly of that tribal region, they are most likely going to be educated in their tribal language, and they're most likely going to communicate most of their time in their tribal language. Yet, when they want to go to college, the only opportunities to go to universities are in English. And so there's a college admissions test, just like we have the SAT here or the ACT in the United States. They have a similar test in South Africa, but it's all in English. And so many people argue that that gives an unfair burden on people who are native tribal language speakers because they're being held, they're having to compete with other South Africaners, other people from South Africa that that the majority are white South African or white South African citizens or mixed race South African citizens who have learned English from day one as children and have been educated solely in English. And so unfortunately this has led to less representation in universities for black South Africans. And so many people claim that English is being used by the elites to control the educational system. And of course, educational system links to economic opportunities. And so many people are arguing that English is being used to perpetuate a colonial system in South Africa, even though colonialism has left South Africa for over 50 years and apartheid has been ended for 20 years. Many people still think the educational system is somewhat of an apartheid system that discriminates against black South African residents. And the reason why it discriminates against black South African residents, once again, is primarily through language policy. So let's think about the future of global linguistic trends. So some people accept that English is a universal language. It's a utilitarian language. It's beneficial to learn. It's beneficial for other countries to learn as a second language because it'll help them with commerce, trade, politics, and multinational communication. But at the same time, those people say we can separate the language from the culture. So we can maintain our native culture, our native beliefs, and not necessarily prioritize Western culture, but we can also learn English to be economically viable and to have educational opportunities and political opportunities at the global scale. So that is kind of like a balance between some of the critiques of English as a global language and some of the many supporters of people learning English as a global language. The last slide that we'll talk about is future global linguistic trends. And Baker concludes the chapter by explaining that there's probably going to be 4 world languages or 4 global languages. It'll be English, Spanish, Arabic, and Chinese Mandarin. And so Baker explains, or has already explained, why English is a global language. We also have talked about why Chinese is a global language in the sense that it has almost as many or maybe even more speakers, both native and second language speakers than English. And that number is close to 2 billion, so that's a very large percentage of the world population. Moreover, China has increased drastically in its political, military, and economic power. And so since it's become so much more of an economic power force in particular, many countries in Southeast Asia are choosing to learn Mandarin Chinese as a foreign language. Furthermore, there's a large Chinese diaspora community in many countries, such as Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. And so in those areas, many of the people who are part of that diaspora community are learning Chinese as well for connections to their heritage. So moving on to Spanish, Baker argues that Spanish will probably be a world language because the Spanish-speaking population is growing drastically. Primarily, it's growing through native Spanish speakers, but also many people are learning Spanish as a second language, especially in countries that are native English speakers. In many of those developed countries, Spanish is now becoming the second or third language learned. So you can see that in the map, which we'll discuss a little later, but Spanish is becoming a very popular second language in the United States, of course, in Great Britain and other parts of Western Europe, and even parts of Southeast Asia. The Philippines, for example, is learning a lot of Spanish because they have a history of some Spanish influence in their native language, and also many of them are already native English speakers, or at least they've learned English as a second language, and so their third language ends up being Spanish. And so the percentage of people who are both English and Spanish speakers in the Philippines has grown significantly. Arabic has also grown substantially across the world, not only in the population of native speakers, but also as the growth of the Islamic religion, the Muslim faith, has increased in many parts of the world. The use of Arabic has also increased because in countries like Indonesia or Malaysia that have large Muslim populations, many people are learning Arabic in part because they are using it to practice their faith. The Quran is written in Arabic, and that, along with increased demographic trends in the Middle East and in South Asia and Southeast Asia, there's been a large growth in native Arabic speakers as well. Finally, Baker concludes with the point that bilingualism in English, regardless of whether English is the only world language or the only native language or the only global language or the best language to learn, bilingualism in English in another language has become much more socially, economically, and politically valuable than just being monolingual in English. So being able to speak two languages, English and another language, is probably the most valuable thing that people can do. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed the conversation and the discussion, and please email me if you have any questions. I will try to post the next video in a week or two, dealing with other chapters in the Baker text. Thank you very much.